History is rarely a straight line. It is a gathering of currents, a slow-building tide that eventually crashes onto the shore. Before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific was already a powder keg. To understand December 7th, 1941, we must look back a decade. Japan was a nation in transition. In barely 50 years, it had transformed from a feudal society into a modern industrial titan. It had defeated Russia in 1905, shocking the Western world. It sat at the table of great powers. But respect did not equal equality. Japan lacked the one thing modern empires need most: resources. No oil, no rubber, scant iron ore. To feed its factories and its fleet, Japan looked west. In 1931, the Kwantung Army seized Manchuria. In 1937, the invasion of China began in earnest. The world watched newsreels of the Shanghai bombing. They saw the rape of Nanking. The brutality was unchecked. Japan framed this as Asia for Asians, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But to the West, it looked like naked aggression. Across the ocean, the United States was paralyzed by its own demons. The Great Depression had brought America to its knees. Isolationism was the religion of the day. Let Europe and Asia fight their own wars, the public said. But President Franklin Roosevelt knew the world was shrinking. He saw the rise of fascism in Europe and militarism in Asia as two heads of the same hydra. By 1940, the collision course was set. Two expanding spheres of influence, one liberal and commercial, one militaristic and imperial, were destined to meet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. War is often economics by other means. In July 1941, Japan made a critical error. They moved troops into southern Indochina. Roosevelt's response was swift and devastating. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed a total oil embargo. Great Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. The lights were going out in Tokyo. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States. Without oil, the Imperial Navy would be dry docked in 18 months. Their industry would grind to a halt. The Japanese leadership felt backed into a corner. They called it the ABCD encirclement: America, Britain, China, Dutch. Negotiations continued in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Nomura met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but the demands were irreconcilable. The U.S. demanded Japan withdraw from China completely. Japan demanded the oil embargo be lifted immediately. Neither side blinked. Prime Minister Tojo set a deadline. If diplomacy failed by November 29th, the sword would be drawn. But fighting America seemed suicidal. The U.S. industrial capacity was 10 times that of Japan. If they were to fight, they couldn't win a long war. They needed a short one. They needed to break American morale in a single morning. They needed to strike the heart of the American Pacific power. They needed to strike Pearl Harbor.
The architect of the attack was a man who loved America. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He gambled in Monte Carlo. He knew the West. He warned the emperor, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." But as a loyal soldier, he crafted the strategy. His idea: a massive carrier-based airstrike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at their base in Hawaii. The plan was technically impossible. Pearl Harbor was too shallow. Aerial torpedoes, when dropped, dive deep before leveling out. In Pearl Harbor, they would smash into the harbor floor before arming. The Americans knew this. They believed the harbor was torpedo-proof. They didn't even put up torpedo nets. But Japanese engineer Minoru Genda had a solution. They fitted wooden fins onto the torpedoes to increase buoyancy. They trained pilots to fly dangerously low, barely 50 feet above the water, to ensure a shallow entry. Throughout the fall of 1941, the elite pilots of the 1st Air Fleet trained in secrecy at Kagoshima Bay, chosen for its resemblance to Pearl Harbor. They memorized the terrain. They practiced bombing runs until they could do it in their sleep. The pilots were the samurai of the sky, highly trained, fiercely dedicated. By mid-November, the weapon was forged. Now, it had to be delivered. On November 26th, the Kido Butai mobile force departed Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. It was the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. 6 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and submarines. Their destination was 3,500 miles away. To avoid detection, they took the northern route, a path of violent winter storms and empty seas. No merchant ships traveled here. They maintained absolute radio silence. Telegraph keys were physically removed from transmitters to prevent accidental signals. In Washington, U.S. intelligence, codenamed Magic, was intercepting Japanese diplomatic cables. They knew war was coming. On November 27th, a war warning was sent to Pacific commanders. The eyes of the U.S. military were fixed on the Philippines and Malaya. They expected the Japanese to strike south, towards the resources they needed. The idea that Japan could sail a fleet halfway across the Pacific undetected was dismissed as fantasy. The Kido Butai sailed on, ghost-like, under the cover of fog. December 6, 1941. Oahu, Hawaii. The Pacific Fleet was in. Battleship Row was packed. The mood was relaxed. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short were worried about sabotage from the local population, not an air attack. As a precaution, General Short ordered all aircraft to be parked in tight rows in the center of the airfields, easier to guard against saboteurs, but perfect targets for bombers. Sunday morning, December 7th. At 7:02 a.m., 2 privates at the Apana radar station picked up a massive signal, a cloud of blips larger than anything they had ever seen. They called the information center. The lieutenant on duty, expecting a flight of B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland, told them, "Don't worry about it." It was the first wave of the Japanese attack force, 183 planes. There was another warning. Earlier that morning, the destroyer, USS Ward, spotted a midget submarine trying to slip into the harbor entrance. The Ward fired, sinking the sub. A report was sent up the chain of command, but it moved too slowly. It was lost in the bureaucracy of a sleepy Sunday morning. The warnings were there, but time had run out. 7:48 a.m. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida fired a single flare gun, the signal to attack. The radio man tapped out the code. Tora, 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 indicating complete surprise had been achieved. The sky above Pearl Harbor filled with the buzzing of Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers. On the ground, sailors were raising the colors for the morning anthem. The first torpedo slammed into the USS Oklahoma, then another and another. Within minutes, the massive battleship capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside. Simultaneously, dive bombers screamed down on the airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Ford Island. The American planes, parked wingtip to wingtip, exploded in chains of fire. The U.S. Army Air Corps was destroyed before it could even get off the ground. At 8:06 a.m., a high-altitude bomber dropped an armor-piercing bomb directly onto the USS Arizona. It punched through the deck and ignited the forward ammunition magazine. The ship literally lifted out of the water. A fireball rose 500 feet into the air. 1,177 men died in an instant. It remains the single greatest loss of life on any U.S. Navy ship in history. The harbor was now a lake of fire. 8:54 a.m. The second wave arrived, 171 more aircraft. But by now, the shock had worn off. American sailors and Marines were fighting back. With ships sinking beneath them, men manned the anti-aircraft guns. Cooks, mechanics, and musicians grabbed rifles. The Japanese faced a wall of flak. They focused on the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway, trying to sink her in the channel to block the harbor. The Nevada was forced to beach herself to avoid disaster. By 10 a.m., the Japanese planes withdrew. Commander Fuchida urged Admiral Nagumo to launch a third wave. He wanted to destroy the oil reserves and the dry docks, the infrastructure that would allow the U.S. to rebuild. But Nagumo was cautious. He didn't know where the American aircraft carriers were. They had been out to sea during the attack. Fearing a counterstrike, Nagumo turned his fleet around and headed for home. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic mistake. The oil tanks remained intact. The damage was catastrophic. All 8 U.S. battleships were damaged or sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans were killed. But the Japanese had missed the 3 most important targets: the aircraft carriers, the oil tanks, and the submarine base. The American giant was wounded, but not dead. News reached Washington late that afternoon. The shock was total. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His voice, usually calm and reassuring, shook with controlled rage. Within an hour, Congress declared war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The 2 separate conflicts in Europe and Asia had merged into one. World War II had truly begun. Admiral Yamamoto's fears were realized. He had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The attack on Pearl Harbor united a divided America overnight. Isolationism vanished. From the ashes of the Arizona rose a vengeance that would not stop until it reached the gates of Tokyo itself. The world had been on edge. Now it was at war.